Okay, we are in Exodus chapter 20. We have a very short reading, at least to begin with. Verse 13. No matter how mad Mark makes you, Karen, you shall not murder. So,
She wants to know if a couple of good swats would be okay.
Oh, yes, I do. She can do those.
What she can do, okay.
we had one of our, when I was at Aberdeen, one of our elders came to church one day, and a really nice guy, and just his wife. They were a wonderful couple from Texas, and he had a big old gash on his head with stitches and a Band-Aid or something like that. And I mentioned to the congregation that I had told Bev not to hit him with the cast iron pan, hit him with that little non-stick pan. But she must have got him with the cast iron pan that morning. Actually, joking about men receiving domestic abuse is in a way very inappropriate, because a lot of men are abused by their wives. And while there's all this support, rightfully so, and probably needs to be more support for women who are in abusive relationships, it's really hard for a man to say, yeah, my wife's beating me up. But it does happen. And really no wife or no husband should abuse their spouse and not abuse their children either. But we'll maybe talk about that some other time. Let's talk about this injunction against murder that we have here in chapter 13. You shall not murder. Your translation may be rendered, you shall not kill. What do you think about that?
I think that makes a difference what word is used, doesn't it?
Well, there's only one word for, that's used in the Hebrew. So it's, how do we translate that word?
Don't take what you can't give.
That's one way of looking at it. You can't give life, so why should you take it?
You can't have that ball of clay and breathe in.
Where I'm coming from, obviously, is the warrior, a soldier, or even
Warrior, yeah.
law enforcement, or in the extreme conditions, corrections.
Self-defense.
Well, yeah, and self-defense. I mean, there's got to be a difference. I mean, obviously, the Israelites went to war, and David, and so that there's. Maybe I'm hoping there's a difference, but it seems like.
You hoping to kill somebody, PD? Is that?
Well, it's not murder, is it? If it's in self-defense or you're fighting for your country or something like that, that's not murder. Murder is when you plan it, or you, even if you do it on the spur of the moment, if you kill somebody because you're angry with them, that's definitely murder, but not if you're protecting yourself and your family. You have to protect them. You're not trying to kill them, you're just trying to stop them.
In context of man's law, at least in some states, a death might be determined to be caused by homicide. And then, through investigation is determined whether it was justifiable or not. But the point is, someone took a life.
Okay. There was a mass shooting in Indiana not too long ago at a mall, and a young man from evidently 40 yards away pulled out his handgun, put 8 out of 10 shots into the mass shooter, and I guess the other 2 didn't hit anybody, and stopped the mass shooting. And The people of Indiana were very thankful to him for doing that. A prosecuting attorney from a big city, I will not name the city, but in a different state, said if he was here, I'd charge him with second-degree murder. So I am the beholder there a little bit, I guess.
You might charge him with murder if he doesn't defend the people, if more people get killed at that time.
Okay.
Murder to me means you premeditated,
Yeah.
that you were going to, there was somebody who just couldn't stand any longer, so you're going to get rid of him. That's murder to me. I mean, and there's, you know, I mean, just like everybody said, there's all different kinds of killing. But premeditated to me, you know, and I know they use that term, but if you're thinking about somebody, I mean, almost if you're thinking about killing somebody, you've already done it in your mind. So, you know, there's all kinds of different ways to look at it, I'm sure.
What about insanity when somebody is out of their mind when they kill somebody? They don't-
What about when they go to the honky tonk, tie one on, and hop in their hot rod Lincoln and head home and take somebody out that way?
That way, but I just think of people that are mentally disturbed and don't know what they're doing, and they all of a sudden lose it and they kill somebody and don't know what they've done. So I know it's still murder, but how is it judged? My God,
Or us?
still murder.
Well, best not to kill anybody anyway.
Yeah.
I've tried not to so far. PD, did you have something earlier? But you raised your hand. Thelma had a point before we started about there's a time for everything, and there is a time to kill and a time to heal. And as we've said, PD did mention that Israel went to war and they killed people. And the death penalty was also a part of the Mosaic law. There was allowance made. And in fact, it seemed to be more of an injunction. What we didn't really have a lot of back then was a whole lot of imprisonment for the life, you know, without possibility for parole. Some talk about that. And we'll talk about death penalty a bit more. I don't know about you. If I'm faced with 40 years in prison or whatever, I'm never going to see the light of the day anyway. Maybe you ought to just go ahead and, turn the lights out. That's neither option sounds all that great to me. I'm not sure one's a whole lot better than the other. I do think that in a flawed society in which we certainly live, it is nice if someone is exonerated from a crime for which they were committed, that we can turn them loose and give them a big check and send them on their way, as opposed to once they're executed, all the incentive to try to exonerate them pretty much goes away too, doesn't it? I mean, you can try to clear their name for whatever that's worth, and maybe there's some legal claims there for compensation or whatever, but it's not nearly as great as when they're actually alive and sitting in jail if they didn't do the crime that they're in there. And I realize that the percentage of people who have been executed who were actually innocent of their crime is probably pretty low. But I don't know what the tolerable percentage of that is. So I don't know if 99 out of the people we executed is actually guilty and only one's innocent, is that acceptable? I don't know.
Maybe that-
No. To one young person, they were maybe older person, but so I don't know. I am kind of full disclosure here on my personal views on these things. I am not a pacifist, but I am increasingly against almost every war that comes down the pike, just because for kind of pragmatic reasons, that it looks like you never really actually come out ahead with the war, and you upset the apple cart for a lot of people, and sometimes permanently in the process. And I am not a big fan of the death penalty, but that doesn't mean I don't think a lot of people that get it deserve it. They may well deserve it, but that doesn't mean we should be giving it to them or that it works that well in our context. Of course, this has also been applied in the terms of on the issue of abortion. And it is used frequently by people in terms of the death penalty. You shall not kill. I mean, again, the word, how do you translate it? And the thing is, we probably don't have the exact word. And maybe the Hebrew word here is a little too imprecise to translate precisely. It is a word that is not used ever in the Old Testament in terms of in connection with war. So the term that the word that's translated either kill or murder is never associated with soldiers fighting a war. And that's something. I think how we use this commandment is very important and deeply impacts people. It's something that gets thrown at soldiers coming back from war sometimes by people who sincerely are trying to follow the scriptures, and sometimes by people who are mocking those who purport to follow the scriptures. It gets used in connection with the death penalty. It gets used in connection with abortion. It gets used in connection with a lot of things. It is probably something more than just murder as like Mark described it, which is premeditated, intentional taking of a life. It is probably not as inclusive as you can't kill anyone ever. And so it leaves a really kind of a big gray area. What is this commandment about? I think it's maybe best understood as not to take a life selfishly. And I think that, you look at the following commandments, and a lot of them are about respecting the rights, and particularly of your fellow Jewish citizens. And by that I mean free male Jews, mostly. We talked a little bit last week about how the Constitution has the 2/3 compromise, where slaves counted as 2/3 of a person for population and therefore representation purposes. They didn't have the right to vote. Women certainly didn't have the right to vote. I think the first state that gave women the right to vote was Wyoming. They did it so they could become a state. You had to have a certain number of voters in order to become a state. And Wyoming wanted to be a state. So by giving women the right to vote, they didn't double because there were more men than women out there, but they increased substantially their voters, the list of voters they had. So it put them up over the threshold they needed to become a state. So the West has kind of been motivated, at least historically, to enfranchise more people, just simply because there's not that many people out here. I saw a line. I don't know how accurate this is. I saw a line the other day on social media that went up kind of west of San Antonio, Texas, down to the border, all the way up to the Canadian border at kind of an angle. So west of the Mississippi, but maybe central Texas, central Oklahoma, and all the way up that way. 80% of America lives east of that line, and 20% of America lives west of that line. And of that 20%, how many of them live in California? So these other states, including Washington, other than the I-5 corridor, if you just drove up and down the I-5 corridor, you would think Washington has to be the most densely populated state in the union because there's cars everywhere. But you get off the I-5 corridor, either west or east, and all of a sudden you get a lot of undeveloped land, a lot of farmland, a lot of logging, forestry land, a lot of places where there's people living there, and more than you think maybe, but no big cities, and until you get to Spokane at least. So we're pretty spread out. So that understanding of our Constitution, the American Constitution originally, also would have been applied to white landed men, all those rights. Now, as the world has evolved, as America has evolved, we've come to expand that definition, thankfully, to include women, minorities, people who own land, people who don't own land. And really, what does the government care if you own land or not? If you're a landlord or a tenant, what do they care? For tax purposes, they care, don't they? But really, it's none of their business, if you think about it. So all of these commandments are really, I think, you can understand in that context. Don't murder or don't kill is about not killing, taking the life of a fellow male Jew. Probably in the original context. You wouldn't kill his wife. Why? You're going to bring her into you're not going to kill his kids. You're going to bring them, they're yours now. In an ancient culture that maybe isn't guided by these principles, the strong oppress and exploit the weak. And amongst the strong, you find out who's the strongest sometimes. But does that mean that's how we have to understand and apply this commandment? I think we have to be careful. There's a lot of really complicated issues, things that were not in the mind of anyone. Certainly, there's a Mosaic provision for the kind of coincidental killing of an unborn, preborn child. It does not directly address the idea, the concept of a woman intentionally choosing to terminate a pregnancy. That just wasn't, wasn't something that was done. It really, at least not very often. For the most part, women back then saw in their children their future, their hope. And we can thank our own advanced modern society for somehow convincing women that they're better off without their kids. And that's a new thing. There were no abortion clinics, and there was no alternative to abortion clinics because there was no abortion clinic. You didn't need an alternative. But even children conceived out of wedlock, even children conceived in difficult circumstances, they were considered a potential blessing for the mother. So that's how they looked at it. It's different than how we look at it today. We live in a very different culture. And again, it's a very short sentence. It's a simple sentence in a sense, but the application of it gets really complicated, doesn't it? It gets really complicated when you start applying it to what actually happens in the stories of the Bible, right? A society told thou shalt not kill is told to go into those tribal holdings in Canaan and kill everyone, kill men, women, and children, including the little babies. Kill them all.
And they got in trouble when they did.
And they got in trouble when they didn't. The tribe that is told, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder, in Psalm 137, celebrates the idea of their oppressors' babies being crushed on the rocks. The Bible wouldn't do that. The Bible always loves babies. I think God loves babies. His people don't always love them. The Bible says a lot of things. I mean, it says basically something for every season.
You know, just what you said about going in and killing everybody from men, women, and children. And God decreed that that's what they needed to do. And we look at that and say, man, that's pretty harsh, you know, thing. But he did it for a reason, so they wouldn't be bugged by them later on, which they were, because they didn't, so to speak. You know, so there was a reason for them to say that and do that. And we look at it from whatever it is, 3,000 years later, and say, man, that's hard to understand.
It's hard to understand when Jesus died on the cross.
Yeah. Same thing.
Jesus, I mean, some people look at the story of Jesus as being, quote, cosmic child abuse. God having his own son killed.
He certainly gave it over to them.
Yeah.
Knew what he was going to do. I mean, that was part of the plan.
The Bible, in a way, may be simple. I don't think it is, but even if it's simple, the implications of the stories are not simple. And they're certainly not simple laid across the reality of human existence. And the way humans have always, including the people of God, have interacted with other humans. So I would say, there's, changing it just a little bit, when I was a kid, there was a debate that went on about the difference between morals and ethics. And when I was a little bit older, there was a politician, and I'm not going to name his name, but he was accused of having situational ethics. And I think all ethics are situational, personally. And I don't have a really good definition of the difference between morals and ethics. But I would say perhaps, think about it this way, sometimes you can understand a moral as our general guiding principle. What we aspire to, what we are trying to live by. And ethics is almost, well, when do we do something different? When do we do the opposite, perhaps, of that? If the moral is you do not take human lives, the ethic is, when do we take a human life? And to take something maybe a little less visceral, a little less troubling, if the moral is, you shall not forsake the assembly of the saints, the ethic may be, when do you skip church? When do you not come to church? When do you not assemble with the saints? I mean, there's a time to not come, isn't there?
Well, and it's funny, going back to the words being used, when do you skip church? And when did you not come?
What does skip mean?
Yes, there's
Skip means you went fishing instead. You didn't come means you were probably sick.
I had a difficult meeting one time with one of the members in Aberdeen, and he was very angry because we had a woman that came and she was almost always late, and she was usually kind of disruptive when she arrived. And a lot of times we didn't see her for a while. And he was mad that the elders hadn't, I guess, sat her down and talked to her and chastised her. Well, I didn't bring up the fact that every time the Kings were running, well, that's to go get food for the family. Well, that kind of, it's not exactly the same thing, but you look at these guiding principles, the guiding principle of keeping the Sabbath. You don't break the Sabbath to get food for the family, do you? Do you forsake the assembly to go get food for the family?
Plus, I found that when you go hunting or fishing to get food for the family, it costs a whole lot more than going to the grocery store.
No way.
It's not as good though. My in-laws both, they like to go shrimping and crabbing. They use these pots in the San Juans, and the shrimp they catch are very big and they're hard to eat. I guess they're really prawns, not shrimp. Not like the Gulf shrimp I ate when I was a kid. The shells are very thick. When I eat them, I end up with little slices on the inside of my thumbs from trying to peel the shell off of them. They're the best shrimp I've ever eaten in my life. And if they catch them on Sunday, they catch them on Sunday. I don't ask. But it is the question. What did Skip? What if your sister-in-law shows up? Maybe she lives in town, you see her all the time. What if your sister-in-law shows up and you haven't seen her in 30 years?
She knows where I'm gonna be.
Yeah, that's it. That's the situation. That's what ethics to me always are situations. If as a minister or an elder, as a lawyer, as an attorney, that's basically the same thing. As a doctor, if you are told something by someone, you have to hold it in confidence, don't you? You may know who committed the last 3 grisly homicides in town. They may have told you they did it. And I think as a minister or an elder, there's someone shepherding, pastoring them, you try to help them, guide them towards acknowledging their wrongdoing. If you're their attorney, you tell them don't say anything to anybody. And if you're their doctor, you start trying to treat, now this guy's got to be crazy. What I got to do to, so you have these different relationships, and triple homicide is a little bit different. There's maybe some exceptions there, but our ethics are situational. Inherently, they're situational. You're not supposed to take somebody's keys away from their car so they can't drive, are you? What have they been drinking? Thou shalt not kill. We had a Church of Christ in Fort Worth a few years ago. A guy came in the building, and started shooting people. They're a big enough congregation. They had a security team, and a team, not just one guy, but the leader of the team was retired law enforcement. He had trained the rest of the security team on how to handle something like that, but he didn't need the rest of the team. He pulled out his own slingshot, I guess you could say, and slew Goliath with one shot. He had 5 or 6 in the gun. They only need one. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not resist an evil man. Who said that? That's not Moses, is it? I tell you, do not resist an evil man. Jesus said that. He also told Peter to shepherd my sheep. What does a shepherd do when there's a threat to the sheep? Tries to stop the threat, doesn't he? Like I said, I'm not a pacifist. I oppose most wars on a pragmatic basis. The wars we get into, the wars other countries fight, that we don't have any. I don't know that there is capable of having a war anywhere in the world that we don't have something to do with, and we don't get our feet stuck into one way or another. But I don't think usually they are worth what they cost. But when they bomb your base without a declaration of war, or when they declare war on you and start attacking your citizens abroad, or your vessels at sea and things like that, we have, among other countries, we have this huge nuclear arsenal. Some other countries have nuclear arsenals, some countries don't. At what point should we be willing to use our nuclear weapons?
It's above my pay.
It's hard to imagine a circumstance. If, say, Russia, just one of the nations that could actually do it, launched a big enough attack to utterly destroy the United States of America with nuclear weapons, if they just launched them all, if we retaliated but couldn't stop what was coming, maybe we could just respond but couldn't stop it. What good would that really do? Probably ruin the whole planet for all humanity. And that might happen if Russia, that might be enough for that. One of my favorite movies to watch, it's a little racy, but it's an old one, so they don't show anything. But Dr. Strangelove, the old Peter Sellers movie back from the early 60s. And that's the whole premise of the movie, the dangers of America acting one way and Russia responding in a way that basically annihilates humanity. And they played it for laughs, and it's very funny. I mean, it's dark, but it's funny. What good does it do? Well, what good would it do to make the planet inhabitable for humanity?
Confirm global warming.
It would be warm, and the whole planet would be a bright, shining light in the universe. So it's just, these are extreme examples, but I mean, that's the whole point of, I think, these commandments is where do they go? Where do they end? As attorneys, you get educated, taught, take things to their logical extreme. What is the final level of your statement? It's one thing to say something very practically and pragmatically about your situation right now, but where does that end up? Where does that lead to? What does that authorize down the road? Or what does that prohibit down the road?
I've got to admit, I was taken aback by your quoting the "do not resist an evil person." I had no idea where that was at, but we all know about the scripture in front of it and those after it. You have heard it said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also.
It's in the Sermon on the Mount. So it's basically Jesus saying, you have heard this, but I tell you this.
But I'm just saying, we could readily remember the others, but I had that one.
Because what do we teach our kids when they go to school and they get bullied?
Smack them. Or not.
Fight back. Stand up for yourself. And that is practical wisdom to that. Most bullies, you punch them in the nose one time, you'll never hear from them again.
Nowadays, they were from your attorney.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, but that in the school
Yeah.
is going to go after. They won't get into who started what or whatever. I mean, they've got their own set of ethics, their own morals about things like that. Some which are maybe better, and then some which are probably not nearly as good. So that we have had traditionally, I guess I should say. So a lot of those things that we teach children, well, I think it's got a human wisdom to it. If your kid's going to prison, what do you tell him? Find the toughest guy there and beat him up. You don't. Hopefully, you don't. That won't happen to you. But that's a kind of old conventional wisdom in that front too. So it's this isn't, I don't think, a guiding principle or a thought with this very just limited view that is to be applied to every possible situation. It is a commandment that indicates God's high value for human life, but also in the context of daily living between people who are similarly situated. Your neighbor, basically. Don't go kill your neighbor so you can have his wife, so you can have his flock, so you can have his land, so you can have his kids. Don't do that. But I think we can understand it, and then in a broader sense, and then how do we understand it? I mean, that's probably something we're never going to do perfectly.
There's another on this, they come and they wipe out, say, New York completely. And what does retaliation do? Well, if you do like God told them to do, to kill everybody, they're not gonna come back and go to your other cities. It's not just retaliation, so that's another thing you gotta think about, okay? If I don't do something drastic, they're gonna keep coming and wipe out the rest of the United States. And so there's always so many things you gotta think.
Yeah, a lot of permutations.
Yeah,
And the commandment about not taking an eye, about the authorization of taking an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, in a sense, it does not authorize the death penalty or form as a corporal punishment or anything like that, because those already existed. It limits those things. An eye for an eye,
and
a
that
tooth
may-
for a tooth.
Yeah, that sounds more like just a revenge. Okay, you took my eye, you're not gonna have yours, idea, not an actual a legal punishment.
Well, it's punishment. It's not. It's not any kind of restitution or anything like that. But it, instead of you take my eye, I kill you. You knock out my tooth, I kill you. You kill my son, I wipe out your entire family. So even there, we can see it as God authorizing violence. We can also see it as God limiting violence in a violent world, in a world where if someone did harm to a family, his whole family might get wiped out. You hurt one person, your whole family gets wiped out. Yet God, what did God do with Achan? The whole family, because Achan grabbed something he wasn't supposed to grab. And that kind of comes back. We talked about this a little bit with the idea of justice. Giving mercy to one person ends up denying justice to someone else. I think the reason God does this, even when God does it, sometimes that's the result. When he shows mercy, I will have mercy to whom I have mercy. When he has mercy on someone, it results in a sense, injustice to someone else. I think the reason God does that and can do that is because God claims the first victim status. When we sin, whatever that sin is, we sin against God before we sin. If we murder somebody, we sin against God before we sin against the person we murdered. What did God say when Cain killed Abel? Your brother's blood screams at me from the ground. God's ears are bleeding from the injustice done by Cain. God can do whatever he does to Cain, can treat Cain however he wants, because God claims the first victim status. You got to take care of me before you take care of anyone else. And therefore God can say, I will have mercy. And the rest of us may have to say, I don't like that, but we have to learn. Hopefully at some point we come to the fact and come to the conclusion that God has shown us mercy too. That God could inflict severe justice against us, but hasn't. And so if he's merciful to someone else, we should be thankful. We shouldn't lose sight of the mercy he has already shown to us. And I think that's the story. That's the ultimate moral of the story of Jonah. God is merciful to Nineveh, a city that oppressed Israel. But how can how can Jonah not preach a message that leads Nineveh to repentance and forgiveness ultimately, when Israel is absolutely dependent upon repentance and forgiveness in their relationship with God. How can they deny Nineveh mercy when they absolutely have to have mercy from God? How can we deny other people what we absolutely need and always demand? If we need it, if we demand it, other people need it and demand it. And maybe we don't have to give it to them all the time, but how can we get in the way of them going out and getting it? I need a certain amount of money to live. Okay, that's fine. We all need money to live. I don't want that person going out and getting money to live. I think that's the story of Jonah. But so it's. I have a couple of things in the handouts, passages where the term is used in the context of non-murder, what we would call non-murder, an unintentional killing, something we might call manslaughter. It can be maybe accidental, though, too. I mean, the big backyard game in the 70s, lawn darts, you know. One kid could kill another one pretty easily with that. They could certainly put an eye out, couldn't they? It's unintentional, but it's still a killing. It's still thou shalt not kill. That term is used there. And it's also, though, used in the context of executing a murderer. You kill the murderer. You murder the murderer. The word we're translating as murder is we use that to the murderer. So if you put that on Jesus, he was executed by the state. He was murdered by the state. The state murdered him. I've heard people say he wasn't murdered, he was executed. If they ever get the death chamber fired back up here, state of Washington, you could say, is murdering people that go in there. If you want to take this Hebrew text and apply it the way they applied it. Again, I think ultimately the terms don't murder, don't kill are both simplistic. They're either too narrow or too broad. Kind of overall is just, take life as something that is very precious, that you do not take human life lightly or easily. I saw someone call one of our ex-presidents a war criminal. And maybe he is a war criminal. I don't know. I don't know that any of our ex-presidents were not war criminals. If you go by the strict definition of the term of a war criminal, it may include all of them. Have we ever had a president that didn't get us into a war, or didn't continue a war, or didn't use our military against people that could not possibly fight back effectively? I don't think we've ever had. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and authorized the slaughter of Native Americans.
This kind of wraps up what we're talking about here. The big idea of his teaching here is that the people of God should be the kind of people who refuse personal revenge and retribution, both in their actions and in their hearts. Christians should be a people who show endless mercy and forgiveness, not getting hung up on their rights and privileges, but willing to give up their rights and privileges.
So if a drunk driver kills your wife, you don't want to see him go to jail?
Well, I want to. And obey the laws of the land, and the law of the land says.
There was a similar case to that in Oklahoma City a while back. One of the assistant coaches for the Thunder, formerly the Supersonics, his wife was killed by a drunk driver, and he came out on TV very shortly thereafter expressing contrition or forgiveness, I should say, forgiveness for the person who killed his wife. Our criminal circumstance here in a way, America, the way we've got it going up, is a criminal case is never brought by the victim. It's brought by the state or the federal government. It's the United States versus, or the state of Washington, state of Oregon versus. So the victim is the complaining witness. The party to the lawsuit is the state, the government. So it kind of takes it a little bit out of our hands. But it's also, in some cases, some crimes, it's very difficult to proceed if the victim doesn't want the case to go forward. And that happens a lot in domestic violence cases and also in sexual assault cases as well. But anyway, so I don't think there's a absolute tie it all up in a nice little bow, and this is exactly what this means. It's something we have to search our hearts. It shapes us and tells us to value human life. If we, again, this is a negative, we're back to a negative commandment, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. The positive corollary to that would be value life. Treat life as a sacred gift from God, because that's where it is. Everyone that has life, as Alma pointed out earlier, is because God has breathed the breath of life into their nostrils. That's where they got life from. And who are we to take it? So sometimes we do, though. So let's try to heal rather than kill. Okay. We'll move on next week. It's not a whole lot easier next week. Simple, just as difficult. So thank you for your attention and comments. Mr. Kelso will lead us in a closing prayer, please, sir.